if you're looking at the media at the moment, this is turbulent market, terrible times coming up. As Mark said, there's a recession, and all of a sudden you see people shocked, and you feel like, well, of course there's going to be a recession. It's been widely predicted, but then again in the media it's doom and gloom. But I suppose that the message which you were given at the time, Steve, was it's not the first time we've had turbulent markets. It's very likely won't be the last. But I don't know if you just maybe want to talk about some different events and what happens, maybe the length of them, and the recovery that's always kind of followed afterward.
Well, good morning, everybody. Morning, Dan. Yeah, it's not our first rodeo, if you like. When you talk about recessions, it's refreshing to hear Mark actually take some of the positives out of the news, because you just do not get that in mainstream media anymore. You don't get it on the BBC, you don't get it in the news rags. Don't forget, bad news sells newspapers. But I think the point we've got to make is that what you're hearing in the press is bad news, and it's all around the economic bad news that we all knew was coming. You don't shut an economy down and then expect it not to, have issues going forward. And I think the point we've got to say is the stock market is intimately connected to GDP, but it reacts ahead of it. So the stock market wasn't surprised by the news this week, and as Mark said, it's up on the week. Excuse me. It's up on the week, yet the news has been as bad as could be expected. So if you look at all the major years in the past that have seen economic shocks, if you like, an economic regression, you can think back as far as 75. I can remember 75, but I wasn't working then, just because I'd make that point quite quickly. But I can remember 80, 82, 91 and 2008. And I was working in a few of those, by the way, so I'll say what we've learned. I think it is very important to learn your lessons from the past, but stock investing is very easy in hindsight, isn't it? You always get, after these crises, the occasional fund manager that says, I positioned my portfolio just in the right position, ready for this crisis. We saw them all after the banking crisis of 2008 saying they were ready for it. Yeah, I'm sure they were. Well, I wonder how many were actually ready for a global pandemic, and I suspect it'll be absolutely none. But there'll be a few saying they were, so that'll be interesting. But the interesting point to make about when the market and the economies have gone back in those years, those are periods when the stock market, judged by the S&P, has gone forward. So you've got to look at the correlation between stock market performance and economic news. And the correlation is absolutely minuscule. It's 0.04%. So they're not correlated. They're intimately aligned, but they don't, stock markets do not predict GDP. So the thing that we're looking at now, and I think learning from lessons of the past, is to say, right, how do people behave during these crises, and how do they behave going forward? And I think it's quite clear that when we see a shock like we saw in March with the closing down of economies, people get very frightened. Now, I'm a seasoned investor. I've invested since the 80s. I've worked in the investment management industry since then, as well, as we all have. But even you get nervous. You're only human. You get nervous when you see such a catastrophic change in the market. But you've got to learn from things in the past, and it was all about keeping your nerve. Now, I know people will say, well, it's very easy for you to sit there and say, keep your nerve. It wasn't that easy. It was the right thing to do based on our experience, but it's certainly inside. I was going through trauma as well. You still get very nervous, because when the stock market cracks, it's always with a different reason. It was a banking crisis in 2008. It's a global pandemic now. We just had a 10-year bull market. It was always going to come to an end. And the catalyst this time was what's happened in the global health crisis. But I think now what we've got to look at, we've seen a V-shaped recovery, as Mark said. Markets are almost back to where, within 0.5% of where they were before the crack. And I think we've got to look at, how do we help people now going forward? Forget looking back. That's happened. Learn from the history and say, right, going forward, we've got to help people with almost like post-traumatic stress. They get so worried by the crisis. When they resume and come out of it, they start to get frightened again and say, I don't want to live through that again. And I think everything we do in diversification, and we'll talk about that a lot more today, because it is absolutely crucial we keep making this message. You've got to set your strategy and don't be blown off course by shocks that happen, because they will always happen. But I think going forward now, we've got to say to people, no, you've got to stick with your strategy, because, for example, going into cash is not a risk-free asset. Your returns on cash are negative. So you've got inflation to deal with. You will lose money. You will not achieve your goals if you radically overhaul your strategy now, just because of a shock that we've had in recent months. So I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot more, but you've got to look at the psychology of investing and say, right, we're in a different phase now. We have the same message, but we've got to enhance it and make sure people understand what we're saying when we're diversifying. All the indices you hear about on the news are equity indices, by the way, everybody. And the portfolios at True Potential are not overly biased to equities. There's a whole diversification of asset class, of geography, of fund manager, of business types of investing, passive and active. You're getting a true diversification across the whole globe and the whole facet of investment styles. So a long answer to your question, Dan, and I'm sure we'll go back to a few more of those points as we go forward. But it's how we help people with their psychology now going forward is what I'm interested in.